So, our last speaker in this session is Grant Thompson. Grant Thompson is a landscape architect with RDG Planning and Design. He has conducted urban tree diversity research when he was at the Iowa State University and studied land use change and soil ecology in Baltimore. He supports sustainable urban landscapes and serves on a board of trustees for Trees Forever, which is a nonprofit in Iowa. He's also a member of the Iowa Urban Tree Council, ISA, and ASLA. Had the pleasure of working with Grant on a number of projects, and thank you very much for sharing this landscape architect perspective with the crew.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you all so much. Can you hear me and see these okay? Someone?
Yes,
right,
we can hear you. Yep, we're good.
Okay. All right, thanks. Thanks for the intro, and as well, it's an honor to be here today. I've heard a lot of good talks, and for the ones that I haven't caught, I'm really looking forward to hear the recordings. This is a really important topic, as I'm sure you're all aware, and today, presenting my perspective as a landscape architect, and really some of the constraints that we have, and I'm sure we're all familiar with constraints in tree supply, but I'll outline some of those, as well as some ideas that maybe how we can get around some of those. In terms of learning objectives, I'm talking about how my job as a consultant, for me to do my work profitably in the private sector, I need to take into consideration all of the different regulations, rules, sizes, minimums, and so on, for the municipal codes for the communities that I work in, and I need to do that on time and on budget. And then finally, how some of those tree lists that I have to work with may be mismatched for what's available in the industry, and whether or not any of those are maybe climate adaptive or forward-looking. Andrew talked through a bit about my background, but it's straddled academia and professional practice. So I really try to bring both lenses to the work that I do. Earlier, you heard Dr. Deb Hilbert present. I missed that, unfortunately, but Deb, Andrew, I, and others collaborated a little bit on a paper where we really talked about how a lot of the challenges that we face with low tree diversity are really human challenges. So certainly there's site constraints, but they're production constraints. So we really thought about this. It's this kind of progressive sieve model where we can start with a lot of options, and through the decisions of others, through site, through so on, we really end up with a few results, and that's why we have some of the low diversity that we see in the landscape. This graphic is from the paper that we published, and worked through some of the different limiting factors and talks through these different kind of sieve steps. But really, it boils down to nursery availability, the planting, the choices of the designer, the landscape architect, my role in this case, and then finally the code requirements that ultimately I and others are trying to satisfy when we do work in the private or in the public realm. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, landscape architects do a lot of things. Planting design is just one factor. And sometimes, and maybe rightly so, some people in my industry get pegged for not knowing plants, not knowing how to pick things appropriately, having the wrong specifications or the details. And while I'm not trying to make excuses, I am trying to indicate that that is one part of our job, one very important part of our job that needs to be done well. But regardless, all of the hats that we wear for us to be profitable and for us to stay in business, just like a nursery grower needs to be able to sell quality trees and do so at a profitable price, we need to do our job on budget and on time. Otherwise, we lay people off and we close our doors. So in addition to all of the review, negotiations, and redesigns with client meetings, every additional roundabout we have is time on the project and fee used. So as a landscape architect, when I'm thinking about plant specifications for projects, of course, I'm thinking about, right plant, right place, right reasons, site constraints, project experience, observations of what works well, either on my own work or just driving around town, seeing what does and doesn't look good. And of course, the city codes or requirements, they take into consideration those. Also, any state or municipal or homeowner association. So those regulatory agencies exist at lots of different levels that we have to work with and satisfy. And at the end of the day, I have to figure out what's negotiable and what's required. And an extent of that is it worth my time to negotiate this? Do I have fee for that? Am I going to get the runaround on another part of my job that I really can't waste the time to suggest a different tree that's off list? And if I do, can I afford that kind of delay in my project schedule? If I have to get something out the door and it's going to take someone else a week or two extra to respond to me, or if I have to go to another public meeting that I have to get on an agenda a certain amount of time before for that approval, can I really afford to do that? Again, not making excuses here, just kind of stating the state of affairs. So I'll use this project or an example. So I have, as Andrew mentioned, my PhD work was in the Baltimore area, part of the Baltimore ecosystem study, but I currently reside and work in Des Moines. And while I'm going to use this as an example, I have great respect for the people I live and work with, the city staff I know well. I serve on our state tree council and I work on our regional uh, planting nonprofit Trees Forever. So when I bring these up as an example, I'm certainly not making a pointed critique at the city of Des Moines or anyone here. It's a familiar example that I can cite, but this would be true kind of regardless of geography. Maybe it's a little different region to region, but this is kind of the ins and outs of what I deal with. So in any community, I have to start working with the city code. I need to dig into the planning and zoning and realize the difference between must, shall, and may. So here's an excerpt from the City of Des Moines planting requirements. So plant materials shall, that means I have to do it, and I have to meet these minimum size requirements. Luckily, at 1.5 inch caliper and rather small height, they give me a lot of flexibility here. They aren't requiring things that are too big and difficult to source. They shall be free from visible signs of disease and defects and so on. Again, this is good horticultural practice. I wholly, in my heart, support this. And I know that these are things that, ultimately we want to see in the landscape. Species requirements. So I must comply with the recommended species. So that's something I have to do. Now, it does give me the option that the city forester may give me some grace on this. And again, that's where I have to figure out whether it's worth my time and fee to try to negotiate that or whether I follow the list and do what I shall do according to the city code. Again, this may vary from community to community, but this is the process that someone in my shoes has to deal with. So we get our recommended tree list. This is the City of Des Moines overstory list. They have an understory list as well. From the city forestry plan, they say they try to provide a list of over 50 species that are acceptable and commonly available for growers. We'll come back to that in a moment, but what this list does embeddedly, hopefully, is identifies those species that they would like to see in their community because they are suitable for urban constraints. They're climate adapted. The staff is familiar with how to take care of and they perform well in the community. And they're not ones that exacerbate existing overpopulation. So for example, if you can see this, we don't have a whole lot of maple on here because maples are overplanted. We have a large selection of oaks that they would like to see because oak communities have a lot of benefits, as was mentioned. Now, you may look through this list and you say some of those in Iowa, maybe they're native or maybe they're pushing for the environment, but some of those may be rather hard to source, and I'll hit on that here in a moment. And again, my job as a landscape architect, on the one hand, I can critique the list or go off the list, but 9 times out of 10, it's more efficient for me to just follow what the list is. So learning objective one, these lists really do constrain what we're able to do and do so profitably, which at the end of the day, if we want to keep in business, that's one of those things that we kind of have to follow, good, bad, or otherwise. So the city of Des Moines, they offer actually 85 species that are exceeding their goal of 50, and they say that are commonly available from growers. We can see if that actually pans out. So on a publicly bid project, a project that I might do for the city, those go to the lowest qualified or responsible bidders. who win the job. And I know I've seen some chats earlier about the challenges of dealing with low bid, and I absolutely agree. And ostensibly, it's responsible use for public funds. We don't want to overpay using taxpayer dollars for things. And also, oftentimes landscape is not the only part of that job. Buildings, aquatic centers, whatever the project is, the landscape is a very small part of that. So the building contractor or the other trades are usually driving the ship on who is the responsible bidder. And landscape is often, sadly, maybe relegated to last, and it may not get the quality that it deserves. And while that's true for public projects, that's also true for private projects, where we may have a little bit more leeway to pick and choose who we want to do the job. We may be able to go with a slightly higher budget. But again, those other site, the things that we do in the project, building other parts of the site, et cetera, may take a front seat, and landscape and trees may take a back seat. So ultimately, this affects our ability to source those plant materials and get quality materials at that. Now, if I put on my contractor hat for a second, whether or not a contractor has, say, maybe they are a landscape contractor and they have their own nursery, some do, or they have a nursery supplier or a few nurseries that they prefer to use. If we give something to them that is, off a list or maybe harder to find, they may have to go to something like this, a brokerage website, and this would allow them to search for multiple nurseries in a different area. So here we have Plant Ant. They aren't the only one, but they are a large one, and they source from a number of different nurseries. So if I were a contractor trying to source something that I can't readily find, I may go to a brokerage site like this. So with this site, you're able to insert the name, zip code, and distance in miles. And luckily, this site aggregates from multiple broker lists. If you read through this, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, NC, this is heavily South and East Coast. It doesn't have a lot of representation, at least from who they're aggregating from. So you drop in your plant and you perform your search. You specify a radius from your site, and you're able to identify where you might be able to get that from. Now, I bring up that site radius. This is Sustainable Sites Initiative. If you're familiar with LEED for buildings, sites is essentially LEED for landscape. And one of their credit areas is using regional materials. So we have a smaller carbon footprint if we bring things from closer by. There's ecological or other reasons you might in particularly be concerned about plants. But the radius that sites gives us for plants is 250 miles from your project site. So if we take our Des Moines example, 250 miles from that, you can see it doesn't quite stretch over to Chicago. It does capture Minneapolis, Omaha, Kansas City, not quite down to St. Louis. So here in the Midwest, in Iowa in particular, we aren't maybe the largest nursery growers around, certainly not in comparison to some of the East Coast or maybe West Coast. But this is how we have to do our projects. And whether or not you do something like sites where it gives you a 250-mile radius, usually closer is better. So we have less freight, that's less embedded greenhouse gases, and it's probably going to be cheaper. So even if something like sites isn't the reason, closer is generally better. So if we run that search here, we have some nursery out of Missouri for Quercus velutina, black oak, or sometimes they call this yellow oak. Anyway, in any case, this is one that I would not typically expect to find highly available in the trade, but apparently this nursery out of Missouri carries it. So if we went ahead and ran this for the entire city of Des Moines tree list, this is what we get. So within 100 miles, none of the trees in the city of the Des Moines tree list are available on Plant Ant at 1.5 caliper. We get about 38 out of the list available at 250 miles and a little bit less when we get out to 500 miles. Now, there might be a few different reasons for this, and I think this is where this kind of intersects with the larger discussion of plant availability, the trade, and regulations. So possible explanations. Number one is a nursery desert. There just aren't nurseries in the search radius. I'm going to list these and then I'll walk through them. Number two, not listed. So the nurseries in the search radius just don't list on broker sites. Not available. The nurseries don't have the inventory listed now. Maybe they would at a different time of year, but not now. It's the wrong size. I can find the species, but I can't find it at the size I need it for my project. it's not supplied at all. The nurseries just don't stock that particular species. Maybe it's not applicable. This particular brokerage site was maybe not the right tool for me to searching. So of those explanations, nursery deserts, I know there are nurseries within our search radius. So, they exist. Could there be more if market demanded it? Maybe, but either way, I don't think nursery deserts is the answer in this case. Could be a communication issue. Maybe some of those nurseries aren't on Plant Ant or a different broker site, and it's a way to be found. And if that tool is not being used or a similar tool is not being communicated to the trade, maybe that's a missed opportunity. It could be an issue of timing. Maybe they are look to serve B&B trees and they only dig a certain time of the year. I have projects that go on basically from spring to fall and even into winter. And so I need to be able to get things in the fall just as I need to be able to get them in the spring. Could be the wrong size. Of course, the smaller is better. And we've had some conversations here about the value of containerized products. The city, in my case, they give me a size, but they don't say what the root ball condition needs to be. Supply or a list issue, maybe the city is asking for things that just aren't available in the trade. And I think that may be the case for at least some of the species on their list. And maybe this broker site, Plant Ant, wasn't the right search tool. Maybe there's a different search tool that I should be using. And while that could be true, I think that goes to the contract side of the thing as well. If a contractor is trying to source trees, they need to know what are those appropriate broker sites they ought to be checking for their given region. So I do think this brings up that learning objective too, where sometimes we see a mismatch between what's on a tree list and what's actually available in the trade. And so me as sort of the middle person in this case, the designer, I have to be responsible for what's in the trade because that's ultimately what I need to be including in my designs to be planted. Because if I specify something that I can't source, I actually have to substitute, and that takes even more time. And then, whether or not those are trees appropriate for moving forward, given climate change and so on. So kind of bringing it back to this sieve model and some of these limiting factors. City code requirements may not directly take into account nursery availability. Ours, the city of Des Moines, say that they do. I think that may or may not be the case, but ultimately the results of which they will be taking one way or another. So if I have to boil it down to some possible solutions or things maybe to work towards, a stronger coordination across the trade and the industry to advertise what's available, anything we can do to aggregate and make searchable current and locally and regionally available materials, that's going to help. It's hard to procure it if you can't find it. And I think that finding or the searching ability is there. And then flexibility when it comes down to code and collaboration with the design community. And, sometimes, again, it comes down to dollars. There does need to be some flexibility and ultimately maybe more funds for the design community if we have to have a runaround to both meet requirements and source material. The time that we spend to do that is valuable time. And, we need to be taken care of for that in that process as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. Appreciate that perspective. One of the reasons we like to get, growers and designers in this is because when we were in the focus groups, when Deb and I were in the focus groups, we just really heard a lot of unique perspectives that not everyone gets to hear if they're always around urban foresters, right? So, and it's great to get that insight. And again, I guess the theme today, if you haven't heard it, is talk to people. Talk to people outside of your circle. Communication. So